So, Santiago, thank you for being with us. Santiago Levy was the author of Oportunidades, then Progresa, then Oportunidades, then all over the world, Conditional Cash Transfers. He was also a vice president of the IDB for many years and chief economist, and somebody that I admire very much for his capacity to change the world around him. So, thank you for being with us.
My pleasure, Isabel. Thank you for the opportunity.
So I had questions. I always tell my students how amazing it was to bring you to India to talk to Monte Caluwale, who was the planning minister then, about the conditional cash transfer and what you did. Because a lot of the discussion was about the politics, not about the technical design.
Right.
But I wanted to start with the vision. What was the vision? What was the gap that the government saw, Cedillo saw, you saw at the moment that you started the design?
We came, this was in 1994, 95. We came from a situation in which over the previous 2 decades, the government has spent a huge amount of money subsidizing food, tortillas, bread, milk, doing all sorts of programs. And the data that we had showed that the efficacy of the programs was very low. There was kind of large disappointment in the sense that there was no improvement in nutritional indicators, and there was no improvement in a lot of human capital indicators. So that was kind of the technical diagnosis. The political opportunity was the crisis of 94, when we had the tequila crisis, when we all knew that poverty was going to increase and something had to be done. But we were very unhappy by the thought of expanding existing programs that we knew were not working. So that created the opportunity for trying the alternative approach. And the alternative approach, which ended up being called Progresa, was really a rethinking of the whole structure of subsidies and the whole structure of incentives. And the basic thinking was, what we really need to do is to invest in the human capital of the poor. And if we're going to break the intergenerational transmission of poverty, what we must aim is that the new generation of poor children have different health, nutritional, and educational outcomes than their parents. And that this should help them later on to get better jobs. So this kind of dynamic intergenerational view was at the essence of the change. And this notion that these programs should be transitory, in the sense that they should be an investment in the welfare of poor households, but not permanent transfers, not permanent welfare, not there forever.
So you were thinking of a way to break out of the cycle of poverty through investing in human capital?
Correct. And we thought that the key component to that was investing in human capital.
Yeah.
And our reading of the analytical evidence of the papers that were about then showed that poor families, for many reasons, were unable to invest in their own human capital. And that was one of the main reasons why they kept themselves in poverty.
Yeah.
They could not invest, they could not send their children to school. Maybe they couldn't afford the opportunity time of going to health clinics, or maybe they just didn't have the information that they needed to go to health clinics, and basic issues about hygiene, vaccination, treatment of simple diseases, or the kind of diet that they should eat. So the program put together what was our reading back then of the main papers on nutrition, food, and education subsidies into a package. And the reason we put it into a package is because we thought that there were complementarities between various components.
Yeah. So 20 years later, do you still think that's true? That that's what breaks the cycle?
I think that this is part of what breaks the cycle. If I were to redesign Progresa 20 years later, I would just add one more component to the program that was not there back then, which is we thought that the core element of children's development was better nutrition between 0 and 5, and then going to school from 5 onwards. And I think we underestimated the importance of other dimensions of early child development.
Yeah, good.
So if I was back then today, I would add to the program, aside from the nutritional component and aside from all the health elements of treating, vaccination, and undernutrition and all that, I would add a component of early child development, particularly development of cognitive abilities.
Yeah.
playing with children, maybe home visits. There's some literature that has emerged as to what interventions.
Scientific evidence, no?
Right. A lot of
About
scientific
the brain
evidence about
development.
brain development in the very early years, and then about how stimulation is really important for children, interacting with parents, interacting with other children, having toys, and sort of being motivated to develop beyond just eating well and having good nutrition.
Wonderful. And so I'm very curious. So you had this vision, the government, there was an opportunity by the crisis. How were you able to manage what is so difficult in a government, which is the space to experiment?
So I was perhaps in a very unique position to be able to do this because I was the undersecretary of the budget. So I controlled the budget. And back then, there was a lot of discretion in the use of the budget. So the pilot program that we started, I started without telling anybody. So it just so happened by coincidence that in a distant state from Mexico City, in the state of Campeche, which is in the Yucatan Peninsula, there was a hurricane. And that hurricane blew away the highway in the state of Campeche. So the governor came to see me. And he said, look, Santiago, I need help, I need money, I want to redo the highway. So I said, look, I'm happy to give you money. And this was really on my decision. I didn't have to go through Congress, I didn't even ask the president, I just did it. I said, look, I'm happy to give you money for the highway, but would you let me try a program in 2 cities in your state, and this program will do this, this, and that, and without any media, without any attention, and just run this program. And so that was the deal. I financed the highway, and the guy for almost a year let me run a program in the state of Campeche, in which what we did is for the first time we gave women money instead of literally cash, instead of milk subsidies and instead of tortilla subsidies, but we conditioned upon them going to the health clinic. And we then hired a university in Mexico, ITAM, to do an evaluation of that. And the first year of that, I tried to keep it as quiet as possible. And then after 1 year, I made the proposal to the cabinet and to the president, and of course all the other ministers was, this is never going to work, this is crazy, if you give money to the households, the father's going to hit the mother, take the money and drink alcohol, blah, blah, blah.
Same discussion in India, remember?
Right.
Yeah.
So, and lo and behold, I said, well, as a matter of fact, a program like this has been running for a year, and this is what happened, and these are the evaluations, and none of this is true.
Yeah.
And I was lucky as well because Cedillo, the president back then, he's a very smart guy with a very analytical mind, who kind of understood the government. And he had been the undersecretary of the budget before. He had occupied them. And he knew that most of the poverty programs that we had back then, the tortilla subsidy, the milk subsidy, distribution of food, was all a lot of waste, a lot of corruption, untargeted, very inefficient. So the desire for change was also in him.
Yeah.
And when he was offered this option, he realized, and this evaluation, then of course he asked a lot of other people. He didn't go by my opinion only.
Yeah.
He asked other people, but that sort of convinced him that this was the way to go. And from that we started another pilot, much larger one.
Yeah. So you went from one, like a prototype pilot, and to a larger, but still a pilot.
Correct.
And that was for how many years?
So the second pilot was 300,000 families.
Okay.
This was now in 8 states. And this was a much formal, careful experiment because by then we hired IFPRI, the International Food Policy Research Institute here in Washington, who in turn hired people like Jerry Berman, Paul Gettler, and Paul Schultz at Yale. And so we did a very careful randomization in these 8 states of households with and without the program. And we ran the program with about 300,000 households for about 2 years.
2 years.
And then we got some preliminary evaluations of what was happening with those 300,000 households. And then still in the city administration, there was a decision to scale it up from 300,000 households, I don't remember right now, but I think to 1.5 million households by the end of his administration.
And in those 2 years, would you have been able to fail if you had seen that, well, the small program worked, but it doesn't work at scale or at 300,000 scale? Would you have been able to tinker with it and adapt it and say, no, this part yes, but this part no?
Yes. In fact, the people from IFPRI wanted us to have the program with different components in different areas. So they could see the differential effect of the schooling scholarships versus the food transfers versus going to the clinics and getting the talks versus the nutritional supplement. I decided against it, mostly on political grounds.
Good.
Because I thought that if Congress found out that, we're experimenting with households, this ones get the nutritional supplement, this ones don't, this ones get the school scholarship.
Ethical questions.
There were a lot of ethical questions. So it was the same program everywhere, but it did give us an opportunity as we were scaling up to change a lot of the mechanics. And then in the third scaling up, we did change the nature of the program, changing the scholarships. At the end of Cedillo, and before the next administration with President Fox started, there was a big decision whether the program would continue into the next administration. And I was able to convince President Fox that, in fact, he should continue with the program. But by then, the results of the evaluation showed that the effect of the school scholarships was mostly concentrated on secondary schooling. The effect on primary schooling was very small. And so there was a hypothesis, and this is a paper, I think, by Jerry Berman and Paul Schultz, that if the scholarships would be extended to high school, the impact of the scholarships would be larger. So in the third scaling up, which was now with President Fox, we added 3 more years of scholarship, not only through secondary, but through high school. And this turned out to be a smart decision. And this was very much based on the results of the evaluation.
So you were able to shift.
Yes.
Yeah. So when we think about a model, and so I'm thinking about your model, that you were shifting until you found the model that worked, shifting the education part. So another part of the model in the private sector would be your business model, where you get your revenue, which in the case of the government is the fiscal space. And I thought the way you went about finding the fiscal space was amazingly smart. Can you talk about it?
So we were doing this program at a time in which the economy was just recovering from a major crisis in 94, 95, a major financial crisis and banking crisis. And we were under a lot of constraints on the fiscal side because there was a banking rescue going on. So, and Cedillo is a fiscally very conservative and very prudent guy. So he gave me strict instructions that we can only scale up under sustainable fiscal space. So we had this very large budget for untargeted universal food subsidy programs. One for bread, another one for milk, and another one for tortillas, which were very inefficient. My calculation showed that almost 80 cents of every peso spent on the generalized tortilla subsidy did not reach the poor. So the idea was to keep the budget neutral, and so what we did is we began to phase out the tortilla subsidy, and the resources released by phasing out the tortilla subsidy would pari passu be put into Progresa. And this, what it did is, it took money from generalized subsidies, and then it concentrated the money only in the households in Progresa, in the poor households. So it was very redistributive, because we were taking money from the upper deciles and the middle deciles of the income distribution, and we're concentrating the money in the first 2 or 3 deciles of the income distribution. And we were doing that with a constant budget.
Yeah.
So we first phased out the bread subsidy, then we phased out the tortilla subsidy, which was the largest of all. Then we phased out distribution of other foodstuffs. And then I ran out of time, and I could not phase out the milk subsidy.
And do you think you could have done it without inflation?
Inflation helped. Inflation helped a lot because the way I phased out the tortilla subsidy was in a context in which as a result of the 94-95 crisis,
Yeah.
inflation was high, it was coming down.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of noise between real and nominal prices,
Yeah.
and there's a lot of confusion. So every so once in a while, I would increase the price of tortillas, in principle because of inflation, but you would always increase it a little
Less.
bit more.
Yeah.
More because you wanted to increase the real price of tortillas by
you
lowering
were-
the subsidy.
Yeah. Okay.
And because this was all done by administrative fiat, we didn't have to go to Congress.
Yeah.
So we could decide when and how. So this is going to sound like silly, but this is the way it was done. If there was a long holiday, just before that, I would raise the price of tortillas.
No press.
No press, no,
No organization.
no organization, and then if something happened, now it's a good time. And it was kind of like, touch and go, and and sometimes I would just ask the president, can we do a little bit now? And sort of, no, right now, this is not a good time. But it was all ad hoc.
Yeah.
It was sort of trying and moving about.
So how did you transform such a complex problem into one that could be managed? I mean, you must have done some thinking about, here is a hugely complex problem, poverty. How can I translate it into a complicated problem that can be solved?
So this was kind of another piece of luck. I had never worked on poverty.
Mm.
Most of my work as academic economist was on issues of international trade, and I was doing computable general equilibrium models. But then somebody actually from the World Bank, the economist for Mexico at the World Bank, you might remember him, Sweater Weinbergen.
Yeah, of course, yes.
Sweater phoned me one time and he said, Santiago, I want you to write a paper on poverty in Mexico. And I said, look, Sweater, I'm happy to do, but I don't know anything about poverty. And he said something very smart. He said, that's the reason we want you to write a paper on poverty, because we want a fresh approach.
Yes.
We want somebody. So he gave me 6 months, and I read everything that I could put my hands on. And then out of that came a paper that was a World Bank paper that basically said, look, subsidizing food is really very inefficient. It's a very inefficient way of transferring money. And Ravi Kambur and Tim Bisley had written some papers about this. Then it was obvious that also bringing food to the poor, if you don't improve their nutritional status, was also not going to be very effective. There was a very nice paper by Paul Streeton, I remember back then, and he used a very tough but still very true phrase. He said, if you just bring food to poor people, all you do is subsidize the worms that live in the stomach of the poor people. You don't subsidize poor people. So unless these people have good health, the ability to take food intake and transform it into caloric energy is going to be very low. You have to bring food together with better health. Diarrhea, gastrointestinal diseases, deworming, and basic hygiene. Just more food is not going to work. So that was beginning the idea of pulling together the components of the program of just bringing more food is really not what is required, is actually the health part, which is probably more important. And then some literature on logistics that said that distributing food was extremely expensive. And that in fact, from the point of view of the local food producers, it was like dumping, because you have these little regions, and all of a sudden free food comes from outside into the little locality. It was much better if you give money to the locality, and then there's a demand generated for food, and then the supply of food is increased. And what the program actually proved is that the supply of food is very elastic. If you put income into households, soon enough, and soon enough means 6 months, 8 months, soon enough, people are going to grow more food, and people are going to put chicken farms, and they're going to put this and that. And the evidence actually showed that there was no inflation in these localities when money was given, and that the diet diversified importantly. Because we were only distributing corn, tortillas, and beans.
So, yeah.
There was no protein.
Yeah.
There were no vitamins. There were no micronutrients. So the diet was diversified by doing so. So this came from that kind of literature. And then lastly, the other component of the program was Mexico had made a huge effort to expand the supply of educational facilities. Almost every single locality in Mexico had a school. And, there was a teacher, good or bad, but there was a teacher. But student absenteeism was very large.
Mm.
So it was no longer a question of promoting education by more government spending in schools and teachers, but is it what do we do for the kids to actually go to school?
And you had excess capacity.
And there was space.
Yeah.
So that's where the idea of the educational scholarships came from.
Yeah.
And then
So you used an economic framework to help you simplify
Yes.
a complex problem into.
it was kind of what are the constraints faced by a very poor household?
Yeah.
What are the incentives faced? What are the constraints? Can be economic constraints, can be informational constraints.
Yeah.
A really good example. Poor households don't know that giving Coca-Cola for breakfast to their children is not a good idea.
Mm-hmm.
It's not a question of the money because they're buying Coca-Cola. It's just a question of having the information. Look, you should not give Coca-Cola. It's much better if you give a glass of milk. And this is obvious to us, but for poor people, this information is sometimes not there.
So there was an information failure.
There was an information, yes, and so that was part of it. And there's some literature that spoke about that. None of these were my own ideas.
Uh-huh.
My value added was basically
Pulling
pulling
everything
together
for Mexico.
and put it into a coherent framework for Mexico, and then gave it a political form, a budgetary form, an administrative form, and a sort of doing the numbers and pulling it all together.
Yeah.
But various strands of the literature showed that one dimension of poverty is informational poverty. Another strand of the literature was very important also for the design of the program. This was some work by Lipton and other people showing that even if you bring food to the household, there's a lot of intra-household inequality. So if the family has 4 children, and the first 2 are boys and the next 2 are girls, maybe the 2 boys will get more food than the 2 girls. Or in more subtle ways, maybe the mother will bring the 2 boys to the health clinic for vaccination, but by the time the 4th girl is born, they don't bring the girl to vaccination. Or most obvious, the boys go to school more often than the girls go to school.
Yeah.
So from that literature, it was clear that we had to target children, not to target the household. And that bringing the children to the health clinic was essential to be able to focus on what's happening with the nutritional indicators of the children, and then following school attendance was essential to see what happened in the human capital of the children. And then also the idea of making the scholarship for girls higher than the scholarships for boys was, again, the opportunity cost of sending the girls to school is lower for the household, so let's make it such that, in fact, they want to send them to school. The numbers were amazing because now school attendance by girls in primary school is higher than by boys.
Yeah, it's amazing.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
Yes.
Yeah. And the nutritional numbers also were very good, no?
Yes. On the nutrition, there was also learning and adapting as we scaled up.
Uh-huh.
And that was also very interesting. And also shows the importance of evaluation.
Yeah.
So we thought that putting nutritional supplements in addition to the cash transfers would matter because there was a lot of evidence that intake of iron and some vitamin deficiencies were really important for stunting and for other dimensions of good development. So we developed these formulas for nutritional supplements. We went to the National Institute of Nutrition in Mexico and they worked out these formulas, and it was chocolate, vanilla, and banana, and there was a powder, and you would add milk and make an atole, like a drink, and that was one for children and one for pregnant mothers. And then the evaluations showed that the impact of those nutritional supplements, particularly on iron, was not there. The iron levels were actually not increasing. And then we brought in the National Institute of Nutrition, and what they said, look, what is happening is that the formula has, and I'm going to say this wrong, nitrate of iron, and it should not be nitrate of iron, it should be gluconate of iron, because the body absorbs the gluconate better than it absorbs the nitrate. Some chemical thing that I don't understand. But we realized that And then so we changed the nutrition.
Okay.
And then the impact on iron
Nutrition
was better.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
If we hadn't done those, and this was taking blood samples from some of the children and measuring iron in a careful way.
Yeah.
If we hadn't done that, that wouldn't have happened.
Yeah. So you mentioned evidence right now. So do you think evidence was essential for you to be able to scale up,
Absolutely.
especially with the change in government?
Yes.
Yeah.
The initial evidence was essential from the first scaling up for Cedillo to be willing to go from the pilot Campeche program to the 300,000 families. And then evidence was essential for him to be willing to go from about 300,000 families to about 1.5 million before his administration came to an end. And then, when the change of government came, the tradition in Mexico for a long time has been that every new government has a new poverty program. And of course, what the guy did before me, it's all wrong. They're all idiots.
Yeah.
We know better,
Yeah.
and we're gonna do it right. And in addition, politically, a program of a previous administration was hard for a new administration of a different political party to continue.
And for the first time in 70 years. So it
And for
was
the
a
first time,
massive
when there was a
change.
massive change in government, and which everything from the PRI was bad, corrupt, blah, blah, blah. So during the transition between Cedillo and Fox, I organized a seminar in Mexico in which I brought Paul Gettler and Jerry Berman and Paul Schulz and I think Manuel Escofias and some other people from IFPRI, I forgot the names, that have been working on the evaluation, and the results of the evaluation were presented to everybody. The data was open to everybody.
So everybody could reproduce,
The data's out there. Anybody can do it. And then I organized a small meeting of them with Fox. And I said, look, Mr. President, this program is working. These guys are serious, don't take my word. These are the papers, these are being published in academic journals. And Fox, to his credit, listened to me. And I prepared the budget for him for his first year because I was in the transition.
So you were working with him. Yeah.
And he told me, okay, scale it up in my first year.
Amazing.
That was amazing. And that's
Change the name.
Change the name.
Yes.
Change the name.
And he totally owned it.
Yeah. And then Oportunidades was his program.
Yeah.
And you want to change the name?
And he gave me huge glory, by the way.
And then he went
world.
from, I think Cedillo left the program
2 million.
2 million households, approx. And Fox ended the program with 5 million households.
Yeah.
And the urban expansion, all the rest of the rural expansion and the urban expansion was during the Fox administration.
Yeah.
And so, coming to your question, evidence was essential. I don't think Cedillo would have scaled up without the evidence, and I don't think Fox would have continued with this program without the evidence.
Yeah.
Because a lot of people were critical. I remember he later became president, Calderón.
And took it to 8 million, no?
He also initially would, I had chats with him.
Yeah.
And he would say, look, this is an electoral program and this is just going to be, creating dependency. And I would sit with him too and say, look at these numbers and look at these numbers and look at this evidence and look at these evaluations. And it would allow you to sit with senators, with deputies, from people from the press and say, look, these are serious results.
Good. So you use the results to bring all the stakeholders. As this got bigger, there are more stakeholders that are watching you. So you first did it alone, experimented, nobody knew, little by little, the one president knew. So you used evidence all along.
Yes.
For that. Yeah. Great.
And when we hired IFPRI, the contract with them stated that they should publish whatever they found. And we didn't know exactly what they were going to find. And so this gave a lot of credibility to the results.
Yeah. I love the part in your book when you talk about the fact that you didn't want to have either the IDB or the World Bank finance this. Can you talk a bit about that? And then you did have finance from them eventually.
Yes.
So
yeah. So when we started, since this was such a radical change, we were taking away all food subsidies. We were giving cash to mothers. Also, we were giving the money to mothers and not to the parents. It was such kind of a big radical change. Conditions were imposed on households and all that. Uh, the political discourse in Mexico in the late 1990s was very much anti-Washington, anti-liberalism, and all that. Justifiably, because a lot of people associated the financial crisis of '95, the banking crisis, with all. So I was of the impression that if I allowed the World Bank or the Inter-American Development Bank to be seen as part of the project, then people would say, here again, Washington is coming to tell us what to do. And so I used the IDB and I used the World Bank for technical support. This woman, Margaret Grosh, for instance,
Yes.
very nice.
Yeah.
We would phone her up and say, Margaret, do you have any paper that this is and that, and do you know whether this works or not? And yeah, in Pakistan they did this, or in India they did that. But I never allowed them to come down, and I never allowed a loan. And since I was also in charge of programming the multilaterals, I was no loans.
Yeah.
And so we ended up Cedillo without them helping whatsoever. Later, the roles were inverted. Because what happened later is, as Fox was taking the program, he sort of liked the program, but he wanted to change some of the details and some of the mechanics and some of the rules of operation, and I was very worried about that. So what I did, I was a little naughty, but this is what I did. I had a good relationship with Iglesias, the president of the Inter-American Development Bank. And so I went to see him on my own, and I said, look, I'm very worried about this program. Can you help a mechanism to ensure intertemporal consistency and to ensure that this continues? So by then, and this was like 4 or 5 years into the program, he said, look, why don't I give you a big loan for the program, and in the loan contract, we put in all the conditions that you're worried about. So that sounded excellent. So we agreed what was then the largest loan the IDB had given for poverty, which is $1 billion. And the loan contract had the rules of operation of the program in the loan contract. And so when they wanted to change, I said, look, you can do this, it's a contract.
Yes.
And so that really helped as a commitment mechanism.
Yeah.
So the commitment mechanism that could be not done through 2 governments was partially substituted through a multilateral.
Yeah. So that a question on that. So as you're scaling and it becomes politically convenient, and the politicians love this program, politicians have a tendency, and I've seen it in so many sectors, to add bells and whistles and start to sort of decompose what is an essence that works.
Yes.
And that also happened?
Yes, and so that has, in my view, diminished partly, and it happened both at the end of Fox, somewhat with Calderon, and then more with Peña Nieto.
Yeah.
So Fox, towards the end of his administration, began to think that he would add pensions to the program.
Yeah.
And they wanted to make...
López Obrador
because
had added his
the mayor of Mexico City had started his own at the
Yeah.
level of Mexico City, pensions for the elderly, non-contributory pensions for the elderly. So he thought, well, we'll do this for all the poor. And since we already have the targeting mechanism and the mechanism to deliver money in oportunidades, let's just add one more component. So it has the food component, the nutritional component, the schooling component, let's add the pension component.
Yeah.
And so I was against this. I was against this because a very important point about this program, which is often missed, is these are not substitute for social insurance. These are programs to invest in human capital.
Yeah.
This is different from providing social insurance, which has to do with what happens in the labor market.
Yeah.
And so if you begin to provide pensions, the incentive structure in the labor market begins to get very confused.
Yeah.
So fortunately this effort failed, not because I convinced them, but because they ran out of time.
Yes.
And it was because I lost the argument.
Yeah.
They were going to add pensions, but fortunately the inefficiencies and it didn't work out, and they ran out of time, and they did. Halfway through the Calderon administration, they wanted to add something called the energy component, and componente energético. And at the end of the day, this just ended being cash.
Okay.
additional cash, which didn't distort that much. It didn't really affect the program, but it did show what you mentioned, which is this notion that we have a program, let's turn it into a Christmas tree and put more things.
Is there anything one can do?
I don't have a good answer to that, because one needs to have mechanisms to preserve the integrity of the program.
Mm-hmm.
And what happens, I think, is that people don't understand the objectives of the program.
Mm-hmm.
And let me exemplify with this with what happened with the administration after President Calderon, with President Peña Nieto. His administration decided that they wanted to add something, a productive component to the program. So microcredits, voila.
Yeah.
So the households that are in Oportunidades, by then the name had changed to Prospera. The households that are in Prospera need to have exit doors from poverty. And so therefore, in addition to the components that Prospera has, we're going to add another component, which is going to be microcredits for the poor to begin their own productive project, quote unquote, and this will be the exit door out of poverty. And so the analytical argument is, if the ego pursues two rabbits at the same time, it's not going to get any. The analytical argument is, you have to have one instrument for one objective. And if the objective is invest in human capital, then you have an instrument called Prospera to invest in human capital. If a separate objective, is I want to make credit accessible to these households, then you need a separate instrument. And so it begins to be a confusion, and the program begins to get unmanageable, because also the incentives that the household face begin to change in ways that are not even clearly understood.